all yours.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Dawn Fluharty here, giving another quick webinar on whether we are or are not in a drought, which is still a debatable topic. But hopefully after this presentation, you'll have made up your mind where we stand on this and proceed appropriately. So like Zach said, if there's any questions at any point in time, feel free to type them in. I'll try and answer them all at the end. If not, you guys have my emails, my text messages, what have you. Reach out. I'll be happy to answer any of the questions you might have. So I'm going to kind of go through this, and I'm going to jump off by talking about whether we're really or truly in a drought or not. So how many of you guys remember this slide from, however many years ago when we were doing drought presentations, and we had our, horrible and extreme drought from 2011 to 2015, which did not end there. But you can see how the drought progressed. And so it's kind of interesting. We tend to always see that slight beginning of that or abnormally dry to moderate dry progression. And so this is what it looked like the last time I gave a drought talk. It was in 2018, and we were coming out of our drought. And again, still, we had some of that abnormally dry, some of that moderate dry, and a couple of extremes in a few areas. Well, now here we are in 2020, and we're at it again, talking about drought, and I'm pulling the drought monitors, and this is the one we currently have up. So you can see we've got our abnormally dry, we've got our moderate drought, no red though, so hey, that's encouraging. Anyone else kind of notice what's happened, how it's kind of flip-flopped? All of a sudden, it's Southern California that seems to have no issues with water, and it's Northern California that is. Well, that was bound to happen at some point, I guess. So it seems that the issue seems to be more in Northern California. And do we foresee this progressing into a full-on drought? Well, we're supposed to have rain again up in Northern California this weekend. So they're saying it's definitely too early to tell. But for us, when it comes to talking about trees, it's kind of a whole nother story. But we are pretty confident we're not going to end up here again, where we're all having to paint our lawns green in order to make them look decent through the drought. So we're not in that kind of drought severity at this point in time, but we are definitely bordering on it for sure. So I'm going to talk about drought in a couple different ways today. And one, I'm going to talk about the long-term droughts, and I'm talk about the short-term droughts. And so short-term is usually when we've had something that's caused a quick kind of disruption in our watering, whether it's, irrigation malfunction or rainfall, or sometimes even when we newly plant a tree, we don't have enough water in the soil for them. That can be a type of drought. What we're going to be mainly talking about today is prolonged drought, where we have seen years of drought, where we've seen years of the trees not getting the adequate water they need. So as I kind of talk about this, you'll kind of see why I'm defining the two different ways of talking about drought. Either way, it's one of the four things trees need, right? Air, sun, water, soil, nutrients. Well, we don't get the water, they can't do any of their actual functions to survive. So as much as we always talk about having to fertilize trees and give them nutrients, water is still the most important aspect. And either we're underwatering or overwatering. So that is always the challenge that we deal with when dealing with trees. So at this drought, I'm going to kind of look at the different ways trees deal with drought, from physiological effects to the responses, to the pests and diseases that move in during drought, and then some of the things we can kind of do to mitigate drought. So let's start with the physiological effects. And I know I'm getting down to all these little details here, more than what we normally talk about. But the reason why I'm doing this is because you can actually see the slide. When we're up on a big PowerPoint, it's hard to see how this all breaks down. But when we're dealing with drought, one of the first things we tend to notice with trees is that they start to close their stomata. So they're not moving their vascular tissue. And why is that important? Well, that's important because when they stop doing that, they start slowing down their photosynthesis. They start slowing down their ability to protect themselves. And the other thing that people don't realize is that when a tree is in a drought situation and they're not moving their vascular tissue, anything we give them, whether it's fertilizer, a systemic insecticide, what have you, they're not going to be able to move it. So we might be trying to help them through a drought, but unfortunately sometimes our help goes unused because they do not have the ability to actually move it through their system. So when we talk about some of the physiological effects, the first one I kind of talk about is what's happening underneath the soil. And so this is where people don't fully realize how important the root system is for drought. And the reason is because when the soil starts to dry out, it's those fine root hairs that do all the water absorbing, right? So what happens is you start getting spaces and gaps in the soil where the water used to be, and now it's more air. And so we all know we can do root pruning with air, right? So unfortunately, that is almost what is happening to the fine root hairs in the soil. So it's a compounding effect on this plant material that they don't have the water they need, and now they're losing their fine root hair uptake because of this basic air pruning that's occurring in the soil. So these are some of the things that we tend to see happening behind the scenes when we're dealing with drought. And then it results in this whole concept of the yellowing of the leaves, the older leaves, and we start seeing the actual outward symptoms. And those symptoms can show up in a myriad of different ways. And I've used this slide before because it's pretty much the three most common ways that it occurs. Is you tend to see the wilting, center slide there. We don't tend to see that unless they're young trees, newly transplanted trees, or trees with really soft leaf tissue. Then sometimes we'll actually see the wilting point, but we're not going to see an old oak do some sort of wilting signs. You're going to have to look for other aspects, and that tends to show up in the loss of older leaf tissue. We'll tend to see it turn yellow or brown out, and then the tree will abort it, and you lose those leaves. So that's something that's kind of significant just to help you identify between drought symptoms and disease symptoms. A lot of times when a tree is aborting a leaf due to drought, due to lack of water, it will actually abort and drop the leaf. Whereas sometimes we have some diseases that mimic drought symptoms, but they don't usually abort the leaves at that point. You'll find like, fire blight and things like that where they actually hang on to the leaves. So that's something very significant you will notice. So you get that thinning of a canopy look, and then you can always kind of track it back to those kind of drought symptoms. Same things on conifers. You tend to see the older needles, the interior needles start to yellow out, and then eventually they will start to thin out as well. So let's talk about the secondary metabolites that tend to happen when trees are trying to protect themselves. And this is something that I talk about a lot when I'm talking about bark beetle, because this is when it definitely comes into effect. And you can see on the left photo there, that's actually what we call a pitch tube, where bark beetles have gone in, bored in, and the sap or resin is coming out of that site. Well, that resin, that is a protective barrier for pests, or trees to use against pests. We also have phenolic compounds that are basically on the interior of the tree that create a barrier zone as well. And these sort of activities that the tree uses as their natural defense mechanism during drought is weakened. And that's why we see so much success with a lot of the boring pests. So I'll kind of review some of the pests that we tend to see come out more commonly in drought. And you'll definitely notice a theme of a lot of them being boring beetles. But let's talk about kind of how the tree tends to respond. We've seen some of the things that can happen, but when you have a tree that's in a short or mild drought, meaning there's probably more of a disruption to irrigation, somebody shut it off and forgot to mention it, or they decide to start conserving water, turned off the water to their lawn, and now they're causing a drought symptom for their trees. That's when you start to get some of that yellowing of the leaf and the leaf drop and possible wilting. We see it as being much more severe when we get into the moderate droughts. That's when you really notice a distinct canopy thinning. You see like that 50% leaf drop, and that's when these trees really become susceptible to pests and diseases. Something that's kind of interesting that people noted during the last prolonged drought we had is the poor callus formation on pruning. So just kind of an FYI on that one. If you are in severe drought, it is best not to be pruning or adding extra stressing to the tree. So that's why we try not to fertilize during that time. We don't want them to push your growth because we don't want to be pruning them as well. So, and then of course in severe drought, that's when we see a lot of that dieback, those main leader branches dying out. We see the whole overall decline of the tree. And a lot of times, that's our indicator that a tree is dying of drought. Whereas we probably had a few more signs and symptoms before then, but you know how it is. It takes a while to go ahead and Okay, I got to ask. I don't know why all these arrows are popping up. If they're popping up on your guys' screens as well, I'm not sure what's going on. I'm not hitting anything. Computer has finally taken over on its own. This is bound to happen, right? We're all trapped inside. Technology is going to start winning here soon. All right, so we're moving on to development of pests and diseases. So when I start talking about pests and diseases that show up in drought, mites are the #1 sucking, piercing pests that show up in drought conditions. And part of this is because they actually thrive in what we refer to as dirty conditions. So if you have a lot of dirt and dust build up on your plant material, mites love it. They thrive in that. So also a lot of times when we get into drought, we don't see a whole lot of washing rains. So we get a lot of this buildup on our leaf tissue. And those mites love to live in there. They love to travel on the dust particles even. And so this is usually one of the first sucking, piercing pests we see that their populations tend to explode during drought. So this one is actually pretty easy. It's actually a great excuse to go out and wash your tree, which will actually give it a little bit of water too. And yes, I said wash your tree. If any of you guys have talked to me in the last couple of years, I'm a big advocate of giving your tree a shower. We take showers almost every day, so why not give our trees a shower? I swear they won't complain. But in the meantime, that also helps with a little additional water during drought. So pretty easy treatment. The only thing I tend to say is if you're going to treat for this and you already have that stippling effect, that feeding evidence, and you already see, sometimes that webbing effect, definitely go ahead and use a fast-acting chemical like the H-Jet, because that's going to knock them down in 24 to 48 hours and stop that feeding. It's not a long-term answer. That only lasts about 60 days in the tree, but it does nicely break into usable nutrients for the tree afterwards, so that is a bonus. But if you want long-term control, you got to back it up with something like the triage products, and that'll give you a couple years protection. So I say that because if you just use something that takes 5 or 6 weeks to circulate through the tree, you have all that extra feeding time. So if you know you're going into drought and you know you're probably going to have mites as an issue, then I'd say, if you're doing it preventively and you're getting ahead of it, then by all means do the triage by itself. But most times I do advocate and say use the H-Jet initially, stop that feeding as quick as possible, because odds are you noticed it once the tree was already in decline. So you have a well-established population, and they're already creating a large stress issue for the tree. So the other one, though, that I tend to get a lot of calls on during drought is hard and armored scale. Not soft scale, but hard and armored scale. And part of the reason is those tend to be out on the leaf petioles and twig material. And a lot of times they are overlooked, and they're a secondary sort of feeder to what people tend to look for. And unfortunately, they get overlooked. And so a lot of our traditional chemicals, like imidacloprids and things of that nature, are not effective against hard scales. So if you're just out there in the landscape doing your normal day in, day out, doing a soil drench of a merit, you're going to miss these guys, and you're going to allow that population to build up. But for some reason, in the drought conditions, we tend to see these guys thrive, possibly because of where they're feeding on the tree, but unfortunately, this is one of the largest stressors, probably because they can build their populations unnoticed, and they do a great job of literally sucking the life out of the trees. So with this one, we have more of an issue. We have a more difficult time treating for hard and armored scales. H-Jet works very well against it, but again, you got that short residual timeline with the H-Jet. So I do have some people who actually back it up with the azosol product to get that longer residual with it. And that's a treatment that we've seen work the best actually on European ohm scale, was a combination of the H-Jet azosol. If I'm actually going after Magnolia scale, I will usually use H-Jet Imajet, just going for that longer control over the crawlers. But for the most part, you're always having to use that H-Jet in order to go after that hard scale. So keep that in mind. This is one of those pests that you really have to look for. We just saw some olives that had a massive infestation that's been overlooked, and it's causing the overall decline of the plant material. So they can do a lot of damage in a short period of time. And then, of course, we always have aphids. And it's funny because when we talk about drought, we talk about more pests showing up. And the first pest we tend to talk about that show up in drought is aphids. Well, yes. So we have aphids whether it's drought or not. It's kind of like the irony in the years when we have lots of rain. we say we're going to see lots of diseases, right? Well, yes, we do, of some diseases. And then some diseases we have show up more in drought conditions. So I don't say aphids really show up that much more in drought. They're just always there. Once it gets warm, that's when we get the aphids. So that being said, I don't really consider it a drought pest particularly. It's always there. All right. And then the red gum lerp and Tortoise beetle. These I actually consider drought pests, and here's part of the reason, because I'm just trying to get you guys to treat the eucalyptus trees in any way, shape, or form. I'm always trying to get you guys out there to save a eucalyptus tree. So that being said, during the last large drought we had, we saw a lot of eucalyptus die back, a lot of big branches dying out of the trees. Everyone said it was drought. Keep in mind, eucalyptus coming out of Australia, those guys know drought. These trees know drought. And a lot of times our big ukes aren't necessarily in supplemental water areas. So they are affected by drought, not as much as some of our trees, but they are even more affected by the pests that feed on them, the Tortoise beetle and Lerp Psyllid. Those are the ones that are actually causing more of that canopy dieback that you're seeing, more so than drought conditions will do. So if you think you have a eucalyptus tree that's in a drought situation, take a closer look, see if you see those notching on the leaves that the Tortoise beetle makes, or you see all that nasty white sticky stuff that Lerp Psyllid makes. Those guys will do more damage to a euc than drought will. So try and take care of the pests. IPS is great. It works on all the pests that attack eucalyptus trees, whether it's a longhorn beetle or that bronzing bug. It takes them all out. So I definitely try and advocate over and over, save a eucalyptus tree. Call it an Arbor Day project. Go out and save one eucalyptus tree. Put my name on it. I'll feel great. All right. So let's get into the pests that specifically always come out in drought and thrive in drought. And this is going to be all of our borers. For the actual bark beetles, the western pine beetle is the most deadly for us here in California. And this is the one that thrives in drought. As you know, we've still been battling it since the last drought. And we were kind of hoping that with the last couple years of good and decent rain, that we'd see a reduction in the population. And I would say overall we have, but unfortunately we are still at lethal levels in the forests and in our urban canopy. I was in Tahoe in the second week of February, and we already saw new attack sites occurring. So the beetles, because of our warm February, have already been active. So we're already a little bit behind on going after and protecting against this particular pest. The one thing I do try and always mention is the fact that it really is more beneficial to do our trunk injections of triage in the fall. We really want to get it in ahead of when the beetles are going to be coming out in spring. And it's partly for the fact that we never know when we're going to get that early spring, right? So with that being said, because we had our early February and it warmed up nicely and the beetles became active, anybody who was waiting for spring to do their applications were kind of behind the 8 ball. So if you can, always plan to do your applications in the fall. The chemical is going to last for 2 years in the tree, no problem. So there's no issue of doing it a few months early, really. And keep in mind that when we're working with this particular pest, you want to make sure that you get good, even distribution around the tree. And you want to make sure you get the full dose in the tree. That's key. If you guys have ever looked at triage labels, you'll see the low, medium, and high rate. Low rate is not going to give you 2 years control. The medium and high rate will. If you're in a very high pressure area, which a lot of our places are at this point, we definitely recommend you go to the high rate. And now with the new Triage R10, I don't know if you guys had a chance to look at this yet, but it's twice the concentration, which means we have to put in half the amount of chemical into a pine tree, which is the best news ever, because as you know, it's really difficult to inject pine trees. So I actually have some experience now where I use a quick jet to inject Triage R10 into a pine tree, and I could do it. I was so excited. So technically, we really don't need the air pressure systems to use our pine trees at this point in time anymore, except for, you know, if you've got large numbers, your hand might fall off after a while, but aside from that minor fact. So dealing with the pine beetles, keep a lookout for them. We know they're already out there. Since we're already in season, you're better off doing a trunk injection and doing a bark spray if you're in a high pressure area. And I say both because that way, while the chemical is circulating in the tree will be protected against that pest with the bark spray as well. All right, engraver beetles. We tend to see these guys more in our urban canopy than the western pine beetle. But don't get me wrong, we got that western throughout the state, so don't overlook it. It's definitely there, and it has the larger pitch tubes, so it's much easier to tell the difference. Usually you can tell you have the IPS engraver beetles because you'll notice a branch here or there dying on the tree. It's not like you're getting the overall tree death. It's just kind of a miscellaneous branch here or there. Rarely do you ever actually see the pitch tubes or the frass, just because they're usually pretty high up in the tree and they're quite small. But I've had a few good lucky days when I've actually caught the glistening in binoculars staring at the trunk of the tree. So it's doable. It is a bit of a challenge, though. So with this one in particular, I know a lot of people wait to identify a dead branch or here or there to go out and treat the trees. And this pest making smaller galleries in usually the top third of the tree, out and below around branches, you can get away with it. So go ahead, if you identified it, got a dead branch or two, inject, protect with triage, and you can save the tree from this particular little pest. But this one multiplies quickly, so kind of keep that in mind. Once you start seeing a dead branch in one tree, odds are by the end of the season, if you got a line of trees, you'll start noticing dead branches throughout the entire line of trees. They tend to be much more mobile in their spread, and they tend to infest faster through an area than do the larger western and mountain pine beetles. Okay, the other beetle that comes out in drought and snuck into California during our last drought is the bronze birch borer. This guy attacks all birch trees. There is no one he won't eat. And he actually goes in and he does a significant amount of damage on some of our thin-barked birches and can girdle them pretty quick. So as you can see, he's a flathead borer. He makes that very significant D-shaped exit hole. If you see that, you pretty much know you have this guy. There are a few things we can do to control him, and this is where I start talking about kind of a plan of attack. So if you have a birch tree and you know there's bronze birch borer in the area, but your tree is not under attack, plain soil drench of imidacloprid will be fine. But remember, we've got to have some water, so do more than just a soil drench if you're in a drought situation. Make sure there's enough to get it up and cycling through the tree. If you already have a couple of attack sites in the area, on the tree, in the branches maybe, you can do a direct injection with the IPS-JET. However, if you already have an attack on the main trunk, or you have a number of attack sites, you're going to want to move it up to triage. Triage is more effective over getting the larvae and protecting the tree for the 2-year period. So we see much more effective results with that. So it kind of depends on the level of your attack as to what chemical and what approach you're going to use to treat for it. But keep in mind, birch trees, they like their water. And we have this tendency of planting them out in a lawn at the corner of the property in a nice group of 3. They're heat stressed. They prefer to be an understory tree, so they don't like being out there by themselves. So they do need additional water. So the more you can water these guys, the better off you are, the less stress they will have. But keep in mind, they're competing with that turf. So if you think watering the lawn is adequate for your tree, it is not. That turf absorbs the majority of all that water you put down. The tree gets very little. So keep that in mind. Extra deep watering for the birch during this time. And then, of course, protecting it against the pest. Goldspotted Oak Borer, this guy. Okay, so he's still mainly in Southern California. I hope everybody's kind of keeping their eye open for him because he definitely survives and thrives in drought. And unfortunately, he moves mainly by firewood, so he can move very quickly, long distances, without us really noticing or tracking him. But again, he's one of those flathead borers, so you're going to see that D-shaped exit hole on the tree when he leaves. Odds are you're not going to see him itself. He's got 6 gold spots on his back. You'll be lucky and should buy a lotto ticket if you do. I've been working with this pest since 2010 and have never seen one out in the wild unless it was stuck to a sticky trap. So don't count on seeing the pest itself. You'll kind of notice the thinning canopy of the tree. Then you might want to get a little closer, look, and see if there's any weeping from any cracks where possibly they may have laid their eggs, larvae are going in. But the telltale is that D-shaped exit hole. We do have other borers on our oaks, but their exit holes are round. So you can definitely tell a difference between which borer you have. Either way, if you see a borer on your oak, you might want to do further investigation and research. Our California oaks are designed to withstand drought. So usually for them, drought is not a large issue unless we have year over year of drought, or unless someone decides they should water the oak tree during the drought during the summer. Then that usually adds a little extra stress, and we tend to see more borers going into our trees. There's an odd little phenomenon we're noticing, and it seems like you can identify an overwatered oak because they tend to get more clearwing borers, or that western sycamore borer. So keep an eye out for that. See if you guys are observing the same thing. We might be looking into just doing some basic research on that to see if that is a distinct indicator of overwatered oak trees. So that would be kind of interesting. But anyway, off topic, I tend to do that, sorry. In the meantime, Goldspotted Oak Borer, it is on the move. It's up Kern, Ventura County kind of area, Los Padres National Forest. It does mainly attack the coast live oak, the canyon oak, and the black oak, but don't think it'll stop there. There's a few other oaks that if it happens to get into, it will infest. So keep that in mind. Just look for that D-shaped exit hole. That is your real indicator for this guy. And again, don't water your oak trees during summer. If you're going to water them now when they're expecting and planning to be getting water. Okay, and another one in Southern California. It's the invasive shot-hole borer. And now with Southern California not being as on the way to drought as Northern California is, do I expect to see more of these invasive pests making their way into Northern California? Yes and no. I'm pretty sure Southern California is going to share this one with Northern California at some point in time because it is only a Class B invasive and we don't have any sort of regulations or quarantines in place for this one. So eventually this guy's going to hop onto a healthy tree that's going to get shipped up to Northern California. But in the meantime, just know how to identify it. This one prefers healthy trees. It likes that good vascular tissue because this pest, the actual Ambrosia beetle, bores in without really intending to feed on the tree because it's actually bringing its own fungal infection in that it's going to feed off of. And that fungal infection happens to be Fusarium. I know, just one more complication. But in this case, when we work with this pest in particular, we have to use high rates of insecticide so the pest can incidentally encounter it while it's boring in. So that is one reason why we use high level and systemics. We use the triage for this one. And then if you're going after the Fusarium, you're going to use the Propofol. So for what we tend to say is if it is preventative, you're only going to be using the insecticide, the triage. If you already have attack sites of this pest on the tree, you are going to be using both insecticide and the fungicide of Propofol to take care of the pest as well as the fungal infection. And it's that fungal infection that causes that weeping or bleeding, that great indicator that the pest is there. Because this pest always does a mass attack. So you always get these mass bleeding and weeping sites. And so you can see that tree from 50 feet away and know there's something going on. You get up close and you'll see the tiny pinhole. You might even see some of the beetles on the tree. But you'll always see that weeping or bleeding going on with the tree. But with this one, since it prefers healthy trees, they tend to say it was not going to be a problem during drought. However, if you guys all remember, that's when this pest really reared its ugly head was during our drought. That's when everyone started noticing it. We started a lot of trees dying. Now that we've had better conditions, we've seen a few less trees dying from it. So just know the pest might prefer healthy trees, but the trees are much more susceptible to the pest during the drought. So definitely keep your eyes open for this one. Don't let them sneak in anywhere and establish themselves. Once they establish, they're really hard to get rid of just because of how quickly they can reproduce. And they're a smart pest. Don't underestimate them. We all did in the beginning, and now it's pretty much throughout Southern California and still reproducing and has not been eradicated and probably will not be. So the other invasive or native beetle that we get a lot during drought is the western oak bark beetle. And honestly, like I said, the oak trees, they're pretty used to drought. So when these, beetles come in and start to flourish during drought, most of them tend to hang on. We don't see a whole lot of trees declining because of the pest. However, when the pest picks up a new disease, then we start having a different issue. So this native pest brought in the foamy bark canker disease, which is the Geosmithia. And that one is an issue for treating or killing these trees. You can see in the bottom right photo, there is this black staining in the vascular tissue. That's that Geosmithia disease, and it literally girdles that vascular tissue. So the trees die almost within about 6 months of a lot of attack. Red oaks, if this happens to get into a red oak, the whole red oak just turns wet looking on the bark and usually dies out 6 months to a year. So we have not had good luck in saving a lot of red oaks who tend to get this, but the live oaks, usually we can recover minor infestations, and you can usually prune out high infestations and save other branches with this particular pest. Nice part is the treatment's the same for the invasive shot-hole borer. It's triage and propofol, because we've had a number of people misidentifying this pest. Because you can see you get that same mass attack, that same small pinhole, and that same weeping or bleeding associated with it. So if you do actually want to get something tested out, send it up to a Keith Escalon. He's now up at UC Davis, and he is still working with these. He actually has a new Western oak bark beetle vectoring a new disease up in Northern California that we're doing more research into. So keep your eyes out. We'll sure be talking about that one soon and helping to identify what's going on there and recommending treatment. So let's talk about some of the diseases that we tend to see that come out in drought specifically. And Cytospora canker probably is number one just because it likes to hit the redwood trees. And this is the number one disease we see come in on the redwood. And the biggest issue I tend to say is, yes, you can try and treat for the disease. But the problem is the underlying issue with redwoods is if they don't give them water, it doesn't really matter if you treat for the disease. The trees need the water. If they don't have the water, they're going to continue to decline. You're not going to be able to protect them from the infections, and they're eventually going to die. So that's why I'm always trying to really explain to people that you have to make sure you water the trees. Step one, water the trees. Put down a nice good mulch layer. And then if you're getting the trees to recover and they're showing that ability, then you can start treating for the disease. So I talk about this very specific for redwood, not as big an issue in Southern California, bigger issue in Northern California. But this is one of the things that we run into a lot. The other one that happens to happen throughout all tree types that seems to rear its ugly head during drought is Botryosphaeria canker. And this one really took a hold in our urban forest during our last drought. And we've seen a ton of it since then. And now we're at the point where we kind of have it around constantly. So we have to be very careful with this one. It's been misidentified as fire blight. It's been misidentified as Dutch elm disease. But you can always see that canker or lesion on the branch. So take the time, look to see where the dead's occurring, and you'll almost always see some sort of canker or lesion going on in the tree. And then, of course, we just do phosphorus. And the one caveat I say with this is always make sure you give the chemical, especially when you're working with phosphorus, time to react in the tree, because it is stimulating the tree to protect itself. So that being said, it's not going to be an instantaneous cure. It's going to take like 6 months almost for our trees to grow and be able to heal and protect themselves and compartmentalize the disease. So this tends to show up in warmer temperatures. So we tend to see it showing up in June. That being the case, you really want to be doing your applications in early spring, so right about now. All right, and this is a new one. This one's kind of fun. I'm not sure if any of you guys have heard or seen this out there. We've actually had this one showing up on our redwood trees. And actually, I've seen a ton of strange things show up on the redwood with just the drought situation we've been dealing with over the years for them. I've seen pine needle scale show up on redwood trees. So this has always been mainly a pine or conifer disease. And now we've had 2 situations where it's tested out in our redwoods. So this is kind of new to us. We don't really deal a whole lot with it in our urban situation in California, but be aware of it. We now are starting to deal with it in our redwoods. The same thing we do, we still do the phosphorus application for this one. You can attempt bark sprays and soil drenches So far, we found trunk injection to be most effective, just getting that higher concentration faster inside the tree. But you're not going to find out really if you have this one until you test it out in the lab. So unfortunately, it takes a little extra work to identify it. The nice part is it's the same treatment as the other infections we tend to get in our redwood trees. So if you get the right chemical, you're done. All right, last one I want to talk about is Diplodia. This one is somewhat, I'd say, new kind of coming into our area. We haven't seen a whole lot of it, but it does show up in drought. And so I cautiously tend to say, look for it. It almost looks like a lepopine blight, but it is not. But you get that same dead tip dying sporadically throughout the canopy. And so we've been seeing some of this out there. Sometimes it's mixed up with drought. Keep in mind when you see drought, it'll be an overall kind of declining of the canopy, yellowing of the canopy, and that you'll see more of the interior needles drop. Whereas with the Diplodia, it's going to be the new tips. So this one is actually the Propozole that we use against it. And it's actually pretty quick to react. You usually see recovery within a month or so. So if you do actually identify this, do your treatment, you'll get the tree on the road to recovery pretty quickly. But please do, if you have any questions, send me photos on this one. I'm kind of tracking where this guy's been moving around and just getting more photos and IDs of it in our area. So please feel free to share. All right, so let's talk about some of the management options in the last 15 minutes here. And I tentatively talk about more water, irrigation, shortstop, NutriRoot, mulching. I'm always a big fan of mulching as long as you're not going to tell me you're going to mulch with rocks. Rocks are not mulch. So more water. So we've always said, you know, the best thing you do is 10 gallons per diameter inch during our months of drought. We know water is expensive. So some trees can handle 5 gallons. Some trees can handle a little bit less. Some trees will take a lot more if you're willing to give it to them, like a redwood. They'll be happy to take 500 gallons of water a day. Don't underestimate those guys. They can drink like nobody's business. But because of the water restrictions we're seeing people try and get a little more, let's say, efficient with their watering. And by doing so, we tend to be perpetuating this problem, salt damage. I know that sounds strange, but the problem is we're using a lot of reclaimed water out there. Some of our soils have high pH, some of our waters have really high pH. And by reducing the actual amount of water we're giving, we're allowing this to actually build up in our soils. And with that happening, it's perpetuating more problems and stressors with our trees. So unfortunately, we now have to deal with this situation. And so there are some things we can do. There's different salt flushes we can use to mitigate the issue, but actually giving them good, clean water is a good first step. And during drought, they're not going to complain about a little additional water. But this is some of the best ways we can water. I don't know, many of you guys have seen these gator bags, the one on the left. That's a great way to water small trees or initial planting trees. But once you get into the larger trees, you pretty much have to go to like the soaker hose or Metabolites kind of irrigation system. And I know we've all been using a lot of drip heads, unfortunately. Maybe get 3 or 4 drip emitter heads in your tree. That doesn't really give us good, adequate watering in the root zone of the tree. So we try and advocate for more water spread out than 3 possible emitter heads. And we're noticing that we're having major structure issues, soil structure issues with that type of irrigation. So if you can, irrigate your trees. But if you're actually going to take the time to give your trees some water, make sure the water you're giving them is being used as efficiently as possible. You guys have heard me talk about this NutriRoot product before and the fact that it has humates and humectants which help hold that water in that root zone of that tree. It just makes it so much more worthwhile to put that water down on a drought-stressed tree. And of course, it's got, the kelp and the micronutrients as well to help for that health of the tree. But I just can't stress it enough, how often you can see the difference of doing this for the trees and making sure the water stays where you put it. And I've used this slide 1,001 times because it's a perfect example of showing the tree on the left did not get the NutriRoot additive, the tree in the middle did, and the tree on the right did not. And you can see this tree was not able to hold on to its water in the root zone water wicked away, was probably absorbed by the turf, and so it had to abort its canopy because it couldn't survive. Whereas the tree right here that got the NutriRoot, it held on to the water in its root zone. It was able to hold on to its canopy and establish itself. So if you're going to take the time to water, by all means, please add this in. It doesn't have to be just for trees. I remember during the last drought, people buying 30 gallons of drums on this stuff and putting it throughout their entire landscape. That's fine. You definitely can, but you know me, I'm always advocating for the trees. What can I say? And this was something that we were using on the redwoods. So remember how I said water is the first step with the redwood trees? Make sure you water the trees. Well, if you're going to take the water, remember, add the NutriRoot. And you can actually see the greening in the turf even from where the water was put down for the redwood tree to get it to recover. So it was done once a month, June, July, August, during our hot months. And it was at the 10 gallon per diameter inch rate. And then this is what the tree looked like. So it was starting to really decline after the treatment. It was starting to come out of it, and then it was able to recover. So if you're going to use water for your tree, please, please, please make sure it's worthwhile that you do so. And then this is the shortstop product that we started introducing last time during the drought stress. And so now, since then, we've found so many other great uses for this product. But the original reason why we started using shortstop was for drought stress. Because what happens when you're dealing with trees during drought, they're not getting enough water, right? Well, when we use this, the paclobutrazol product, it actually reduces the elongation and growth of the canopy and redirects that energy into root growth, fine root growth. And so that makes it so that way it's not wasting its water, it's not wasting extra nutrients on a canopy it can't support, and it's actually putting out more roots to find what it really needs to survive during drought. So looks like we're back to using this product possibly for drought. And it's one of those things. Yes, the side benefit is you don't have to prune the tree as often, but the main reason why we tend to do it is because of the water. So the one thing that people don't necessarily realize is also by reducing the canopy, if you're also in a stress situation of micronutrients, the tree can better use the micronutrients that are available to it, and we get a lot less micronutrient stress during the drought as well. So we get a lot of less that kind of leaf tissue burning, that marginal burning, and that sun scorch occurring. And this was actually a study out of Michigan where they tested the paclobutrazol in a drought condition. So they introduced drought by not watering the trees. You can see the gator bags there they were using for watering. The tree on the left did not get the shortstop. The tree on the right did, and it was able to maintain its canopy during the drought conditions. And this is what it looks like when the tree is utilizing the paclobutrazol. You can see on the left it has much longer internodes, larger, more delicate leaves, where on the right, the internodes are shorter, the leaf tissue is a little bit smaller, and it's got a thicker cuticle. That makes that tree so much more defensible against the drought stress. So that's part of the reason why we started talking about this and using this product initially. So if you're dealing with drought, you put this down once every 2 years, and you can help protect your tree with drought. The last thing I want to cover in the last couple of minutes I have here is treating for chlorosis and drought. And there's a reason. We have two products we use, the MN-Jet FE and the Palm-Jet. And during drought, trees don't have as much water in their vascular tissue, right? So a lot of times, if you go ahead and you do an application of one of these products, it's not going to move throughout the tree. So it's really important that we water. I know, I've said it 1,000 times. I'll say it 1,000 more. You know me. If you can water the tree prior to any application, whether it's trunk injection, soil drench, bark spray, you always want to water the tree a little bit before. That gets that tree moving its vascular tissue. And then you'll go in and do your application, whether it's an insecticide, nutrient, fertilizer, or fungicide. And then you're going to water it in again to make sure that product really moves up through the tree itself. And that really kind of gets it going. So with that being said, I always kind of talk about the fact that we are in a drought. We are perpetually in a drought in the urban canopy. Everyone always says, tree work isn't rocket science. Well, I tend to disagree. And that is just because it is rocket science trying to grow a tree in our urban canopy this day and age. With all the hardscapes we have, all the different conditions our poor trees are subjected to, trying to get a tree to grow happy and healthy in an urban canopy is rocket science. And so keep that in mind when we're working with these trees, is that even if they're considered drought tolerant in California, they are not drought tolerant to what we subject them to. If we give them a nice little 4-inch square of dirt and the rest is concrete, they are perpetually in a drought. They need that additional water, especially when we're in reduced rainfall and increased drought situations. So keep that in mind. That has always been kind of my stance, is that the urban trees are always suffering from drought unless someone's in there overwatering. So I hope you guys have any questions. Whoops, one more. There we go. I'm happy to answer any you might have. I hope this was kind of a quick introduction into what we can do to help mitigate the drought. But yes, that is my presentation for today.
Nicely.
Jack, do we have any questions that were typed in?
We do. We have, I found one so far from someone named Emmett. The question is, can triage be mixed with proposal?
Good question, Emmett. So triage, the original RUP, cannot be mixed with proposal. Triage G4 cannot be mixed with proposal, but nail on the head, triage R10 can be mixed with proposal, which makes it ideal for treating for those disease and pest complexes.
All right, excellent answer. It's very good to know that triage R10 can be mixed with proposal. And then a couple more coming in right now. Excellent. Is it helpful to use shortstop with NutriRoot for drought-stressed redwoods?
Yes. So you can mix shortstop with NutriRoot and do a dual application. We have some research that is pending, so you should be seeing some photos coming out of that soon. But it is something that can be done, and at this point it is something we see as being beneficial. So good question.
Excellent, excellent. Next one is more of a statement. It looks like having issues with Canary Island pines dying from the top. So any thoughts on what could be causing that?
If you have Canary Island pines dying from the top, I would definitely be looking for that IPS Engraver Beetle. I would also be looking to see what's going on with their roots. So if you would like to send me a photo of the entire tree and the top of the tree, I would be very happy to help you identify what might be going on.
All right. Let's see. I have a California redwood in my yard in Round Rock, Texas. It has a white fungus at the base of the tree. Any thoughts as to what that might be?
A white fungus at the base of your tree. Is it? Well, I would definitely want to see photos. If it's on the bark, I wouldn't be concerned. Odds are it's probably in turf and getting overwatered and you're getting some sort of like maybe lichen on there. However, if it's something that's getting into the growth cracks or under the bark, I would be very concerned and probably looking for some sort of fungal infection. So please feel free to send me a photo of that one.
A couple more statements. Brenda, thank you so much. I always enjoy your presentation. And then Sam, would NutriRoot best be used before drought or to help manage or to help damaged plants after the drought ends? Thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you. So actually, my best recommendation is if you can predict when the rain's going to stop, do it just before the rain stops. I know that's a complicated one. It's best to actually get NutriRoot going as soon as we know the trees are going to be going into distress. So, for instance, if your rain normally stops in, April, then I usually start putting the NutriRoot down come May. So there's still moisture in the soil, so it can still be absorbed and be as effective as possible without getting that kind of, hydrophobic layer you got to break through on the soil surface. But it can be done as, a rescue afterwards as well. But it is definitely better to get in there at the beginning.
right. All right, scrolling through. All right. That was all the questions, so keep them coming in. If you got more, I'm gonna stop the recording.